Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short presentation on crisis imperatives for leaders. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Manley, who's a specialist in this field. He's been working with top leaders and international business and government leaders for many, many years now. He's also the author of the book Leadership, and he's here to talk to me today in a two-part series on these crisis imperatives. Mark, great to have you with us.
Andy, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and particularly around about now, where leadership is in such high demand at a time of crisis. That's what the world needs, is good leadership.
So certainly on the back of this COVID-19, as we are definitely in unprecedented times, I guess it's all about leaders knowing how to step up and take responsibility in the midst of this crisis.
Yes, that's exactly right. But remember, a leader is only a leader in that they have followers. So the impact of a leader on the whole world, because of the multiplier effect of what they do and ask for, and the followers actually following that lead, can change the world. And when the world is needing to be changed out of a crisis into something that is more palatable or more growth oriented or certainly more comfortable, it's leaders that are going to make a big difference.
So you've put out a communication around what you see as being the top 10 principles, the top 10 crisis imperatives for leaders. Let's go through those, Mark. The first one that you talk about is this idea that leaders must make decisions. It's about direction and action. Talk us through that.
Well, first of all, the 10 imperatives, or some people have already started calling them the 10 commandments of crisis leadership. They're based in a lot of research. So there's a lot of substance and foundation to this. It's not just, the glib sort of one-liners, as you might have seen. But the first one, in terms of making decisions, obviously all decisions, leaders have to make decisions. All decisions need to be based in something that is really substantial to what the leader and the following group or the sphere of impact is wanting to achieve. That is usually called a strategy. So we make decisions in terms of where the strategy needs to go. Many times, strategy in the time of a crisis has to actually be adapted, sometimes radically, to ensure the survival of the organization. And so as the leader makes decisions, so the strategy needs to be responding to that. The followers need to be responding to what the leader is actually deciding and communicating that. Decisions aren't just made in a vacuum. Decisions obviously are made with a lot of consultation. They're made with a lot of, hopefully, research and evidence-based kind of decision making. But it does determine direction and action. Without the decision, we'll all just be faffing around. We'll be, in the words of Mr. Bean, namby-pamby, fiffy-faffy, itsy-bitsy, wishy-washy. And the crisis will perpetuate ad infinitum, tragically. And too often leaders abrogate their responsibility. They step back from actually making the key decision that is going to propel the organization or that community out of the crisis into something that is better.
Mark, it strikes me that this is exactly how we can see differences in the way leaders have responded, even on a global scale. Some leaders have responded very quickly, and some leaders seem to have held back in terms of making decisions. Any thoughts on whether this is about making fast or slow decisions in a crisis?
Yeah, the speed, a crisis is determined by time. If we had lots and lots of time, the crisis wouldn't actually be there. The urgency factor creates a crisis. When something is long and protracted, it is just a problem that is important, but it can be solved over time. And people misread it. When there is a need for urgency, which is related to a very short timeline, that defines the crisis. When it is a crisis, you're needing short timeline kind of decisions as well. So when you hang back and hope that the crisis is just going to go away by itself, very often that doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, and so some leaders are thankful for that. But it takes guts, and it takes boldness, and it takes courage and bravery to make the big, bold decision to say, this is what we are going to do. We have to do it now because we are in crisis. Urgency is upon us. Let's move.
Your second imperative, Mark, is that they need to inspire confidence. I was reading some research just this week from Edelman on the trust barometer, and it would seem as if trust is at an all-time low across most sectors, where very few people are able to really say with confidence that they trust organizations or institutions, both from an ethical point of view and from a competence point of view. How do leaders do this?
Isn't that tragic? At a time when we need to be trusting the people that are in the front line and in charge, that's when the confidence is really, really down. Confidence is not built up overnight. However, in crisis, it is a time for better leadership, often to step up and create the trust that is going to propel them into the future and into greater and greater leadership. So how do you build confidence? You build that trust, and I subscribe to some of the current research that is looking at some new developments that are happening in trust dynamics. So, for example, one of the big things is empathy. People trust people that they feel empathize with them. If I feel that my leader is understanding me and has empathy for my situation, my challenges, and my stress, then I will trust that person. The second thing is authenticity. This is as old as the hills. Say it, mean it, do it. And when that actually starts happening and kicking into place, then people start trusting that as well. The third big thing is reason. So previously, very often people would trust the emotional kind of a response, but it's more and more these days in the current world where people are trusting reason. And this is a big switch over in the last 50 years or so, what the research is indicating, that when the leaders indicate that they are doing things based on reason and not just an emotional gut feel kind of reaction to what's going on, people then tend to trust those leaders. And then the fourth one is a big one, and it's quite a big change as well. It's an idea of continuous improvement. So previously, we're going back over a number of decades now, people would be looking for consistency. This is the way I've always thought, and this is the way I'll continue to think. However, the world is changing so rapidly. The world has moved on, and tomorrow might be different than today. Particularly in the midst of crisis, things are moving so fast. So we tend to trust leaders who are continuously improving. So it's not about being consistent and never changing. Now it is rather about saying, we expect you to change because the world is changing. But in addition to that, we must make sure that your changes are leading to something that is better, not just something that is changed for the sake of change and a quick reaction and knee-jerk thing. Change for the better, continuous improvement, move on into the future with confidence.
Mark, what about this idea that I've got to build trust on what was done previously, but what if that hasn't happened? What if there was no reference point? What if people haven't had a good track record? Can leaders still inspire confidence?
Yes, and here it takes digging deep into the psyche of your led community, as I call it. People will end up trusting other leaders, even though they've got no track record. We do this every day. We see a person who is in authority, and by some kind of vicarious institutional mechanism, we will trust a person who is wearing a uniform of an institution that we trust, for example. So that's a vicarious trust that we put onto the person. If such a mechanism is not available, then what leaders have to do is very, very fast work on building a confidence base so that they can actually show that they are trustworthy on the basis of their expertise, they're on the basis of their good sense, on the basis of good, clever decision making, and just generally a mechanism that is trustworthy. There's certain psychological things that influence us to trust certain people more than others. Some of them are just emotional, but they work anyway. So it can be built in a short time. That's what I'm saying. But it's always better to try and have trust that is going to go, that's going to be based on something that is of a long-term basis of confidence building.
Mark, your third crisis imperative is that leaders need to mobilize effective behaviors. What are those effective behaviors? And you also talk about understanding motivation. Can a leader motivate somebody or not?
That's the big question that goes back millennia. So the thinking has been for the last many decades, in fact, already, that leaders can't motivate others. What leaders can do is assist people to be motivated. They have to motivate themselves. Motivation always comes from the inside. And so no matter what the trappings are, how big the stick is, or how wonderful the sweets are that are trying to influence your behavior, you are still making choices on what is expected in that motivational situation. So mobilize effective behaviors, and the motivation that comes from leaders is often a thing of persuasion and often a thing again of the logic, rational, trust base. So I subscribe to a great scholar, Victor Froome from Canada, and essentially it comes down to two big things. I'm simplifying it over here, I am a reductionist. So it comes down to two big things, and that is people must want to achieve that which the leader is encouraging them to achieve. They must want the outcome of what their behavior is. And then number two, linked into that very directly, is they must believe that their behavior is going to give them exactly that consequence. If either of those is out of kilter, in other words, they might want something, but they don't believe that anything they do will change the outcome, they're not going to even try. On the other hand, they might not want it, and they know that if they put some effort into it, they could achieve it, but then it's just boring anyway, they still don't want it. So those two things have to be in place. I want it, I believe that I can achieve it, then we're going to put ourselves into it. So then the leader imperative, the leadership imperative is to persuade people of their want of a particular outcome, whatever it is. And that's where incentivization comes in, making people happy, whatever it is going to be, relieving their pain. Number two, they must be able to persuade their led community that they can actually do it. That with the right kind of efforts and energy and tactics and strategies and throwing kilojoules and time and resources at a particular project, they will achieve the outcome that they all now desire. So those are the two big things for motivation that I certainly subscribe to. It does get a lot more complex than this, but when you are motivating and ensuring the motivation of your people, that's what's going to bring about the effective behaviors. So usually in a crisis, again, what the leader has to do is make sure that behaviors change. If behaviors just continue like they are, you're not going to get out of your crisis very quickly.
So, Mark, let's try and anchor this in a specific context. Here in South Africa, we're now in the middle of a lockdown. I like to reframe that as sheltering in place. But let's face it, we've been asked to physically distance ourselves. We've been asked to wash our hands. And we were given options to do that up to a point. And then suddenly our president stepped in and said, right, I'm going to force you to behave in a particular way. Was that necessary, do you think? And ultimately, is this something that can be enforced? Are people in many of our communities going to be able to subscribe to these behaviors?
Certainly, there's got to be an attempt in this, and already the impact of this is being felt far and wide throughout the nation, but not only in this particular country, but it's around about half the world, I believe, now is in some kind of a lockdown of some sort. With varying degrees of what would we call it, lack of movement. And the world is going to be very different in 2 months' time because of this very thing. If it wasn't enforced, very often people would just continue same old, same old. I'm sure this is not going to affect me. I'm sure that I'm not going to infect anybody else. And the default of people is to slip back into their zones of predictability, and which we would normally call a comfort zone. Same old, do the same things, it's going to be all right. So sometimes it takes a massive intervention when the crisis demands it, a massive intervention to cut across that behavior and say, no, we have to change our behavior to change the outcome. The road which we are on now under our current normal behavior leads to disaster. We are changing that. We're taking a whole detour around the disaster. And yes, we will get back to normal sometime in the future, but it's not on this road. Let's move.
But Mark, it sounds then that as much as you and I over the years have advocated for a more collaborative type of leadership, that you're almost proposing that in a crisis, that very directive, dare I say, command and control leadership is required, if not necessary.
When we have the luxury of time and a reduced urgency and a consequence that is not very serious if we don't take it too seriously ourselves, then yeah, we can participate and collaborate as much as we want to make sure that everybody's on board. However, if I'm in a ship that is sinking, I do not want the captain to be a participative kind of leader in that moment. I don't want to set up work groups and workshops as to what to do next. This is a crisis. Save our lives and your own life, and if possibly the ship. And that requires very decisive leadership, which is going to save us all. And that's when we subscribe to it and we say, right, at the moment, there's some big things happening over here, which I can't be on top of. I can't save myself in a situation like this. In fact, I might be making the wrong decisions because I don't have the right information. So I will then give allegiance to a leader who is displaying these kinds of characteristics. And so, yes, to cut that long story short, in a crisis, leaders have to be much more directive and do the job that sometimes leadership requires.
What would you say, Mark, to people who have pushed back about a loss of civil liberties in this whole lockdown? It sounds as if you're saying, well, in certain contexts, it is actually not only imperative, but it is actually critical for survival.
Absolutely. And this, I think, then starts moving into a whole philosophical thing of utilitarianism, where are we going to achieve the greatest good for the greatest amount of people? Or are we going to subscribe to some kind of Darwinian thinking of those who survive this thing are going to be the fittest, and we can start post-apocalyptic, moving on with some kind of new world, and see what that leaves. However, that's going to also leave us in great pain, and it's going to leave devastated countries, communities, families, individuals, if we don't actually subscribe to something which is in fact research-based and evidence-based, and is quite probably going to save exactly those groups that I've spoken of already. So yeah, it's a tough one. And as much as we subscribe to the civil liberties and so on, there is a time when the crisis demands that the civil liberties get suspended, never eradicated, just suspended long enough for the crisis to be over. Once the crisis is over, we revert back to that precious thing that history has fought for in terms of civil liberties and personal freedom.
Crisis imperative number 4, Mark. The leader must create hope. I think that certainly is in short supply at the moment, and people are consuming a healthy diet of fake news and rumors and misinformation. How do we counter that with this message of the future worth fighting for?
Yeah, of all these 10 imperatives for leaders, this is probably my favorite one. Some people would say it is vision, but it is this desirable future. This is something that post-calamity, post-crisis, there's going to be something that it's worth enduring this thing for. Otherwise, we give up. And here we can go back through the ages, and all the great leaders have been able to create hope in the midst of some kind of crisis and calamity. You think of Viktor Frankl, who in the midst of great personal terror and horror in the concentration camps of the Second World War, able to develop a whole thing around his logotherapy and transcendence, being able to say there is a future, there is something beyond this horror that we are existing now. And our horror is very minor compared to what he had to endure. And yet he was able to do it. Not only him, but countless others through history have been able to survive based on how they've been able to project to the post-apocalyptic, to the post-calamitous, to the post-crisis situation that eventually they will end up in if they actually just endure through this. And that's what makes it worthwhile, knowing that the leader has created in our minds this image of what the future can be once we've gone through this thing. So that's hope. Very, very, very important.
This idea, Mark, of a preferred future, I guess, recognizing that the future is not one but many, and that we can create and be part of that. What about timelines? So as this goes on, is there not a real danger that people start to lose hope? And how do leaders create that momentum around not just creating hope, but sustaining it?
Yes. Well, first of all, as you mentioned already, you've got to listen to the right stuff. I think it was Steven Pinker who recently, in one of his great books, said that our preference is to listen to a bad news story on a ratio of 8-1 before we listen to a good story. And that's just hardwired into our brains. Unfortunately, that's what's come down to us through our ancestors. So, yeah, we tend to gravitate towards the bad news story. However, we need to certainly try and guard our minds towards something that is creating hope, not losing hope. So, again, this is a self-discipline and also a discipline of leaders. There's ancient wisdom that says hope deferred makes the heart sick. So if you're creating a wonderful thing and say, well, we're going to all be fine and living in paradise in 2 months' time, and then 2 days before, and you say, oh, I was wrong, we're going to be stuck down for another 3 months. That's when a big problem happens, because now we are all totally disappointed, and it's worse than if we were never given that kind of timeline to start with. So we have to be very, very careful in how we manage our expectations and how we manage this hope and expectation of that desirable preferred future.
Mark, your fifth one is leaders must enforce action. That's a very strong word. You've obviously chosen that word specifically. Tell us why.
Well, it goes back to one of our previous points. When there is a crisis, it is so important to be able to make the decision and then get the decision bedded down into the communities for their own good in a way. And yeah, I'm walking a very thin edge over here in terms of the autocracy dictatorship kind of a thing. But in many instances, when there has been the great catastrophic need for a leadership that is going to take people through the calamity, it's usually been done on the basis of some kind of enforced action. And so too often when leaders are soft and they blur the edges in terms of what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, it actually perpetuates the problem and the crisis to the detriment of the entire community. And so, yeah, I mulled on this particular word for a long time, enforced action. So the decision has been made. We are in a crisis. It is our intention to get through this crisis as quickly as possible. And so leaders now have to take the action that is going to ensure that the decision that is best for all of us is actually going to be something that doesn't that takes root and that doesn't cause great damage if it is not adhered to.
Mark, is there some situational leadership thinking coming here? I'm thinking back to history where we've seen great political leaders who were brilliant at the enforcing action in a crisis. But when it came to a different context, people weren't as quick to want to follow them.
Absolutely right. There's the old saying, comes the time, comes the person or the leader. And yeah, there is a certain amount of that. People have, and this is part of my contribution to this leadership understanding thing, there are different styles of leadership. And so there will be a time when the kind of leadership that we all require is very pioneering, taking us into the future, making sure that we get excited about this adventure that lies ahead of us. There will be a time when we need to belong to our whole community. And so the leadership that we require is more oriented towards teaming and pastoral type stuff. There will be a time when leaders need to be empowering their people for them to move ahead and for them to be highly motivated. And then there is a time, particularly in a crisis, when leaders need to just drive the system home to make sure that the whole community has a beneficial consequence to the kind of leadership that is going to enforce the right kinds of decisions, not self-serving decisions, but socially serving decisions. The decisions that are going to take the whole world or the whole community and not just some narcissistic kind of indulgence into the future. But and that's got to be communicated in such a way that people understand that there will be an end to this. If there is no end to it, then we're moving into the whole thing of capitulating to some kind of dictatorial variance in our history. The trajectory of history is moving towards personal freedom. There will be anomalies when we are in a crisis, such as we are now. In every business, in every organization, there will be certain times of crisis when leaders need to enforce a certain thing to take us forward.
We're talking crisis imperatives with Dr. Mark Manley. We're at number 5. We've got 5 to go. This is the end of part 1. Join us for part 2 of this particular presentation.
Thank you, Andy.